It's great to be here, all together, but on Zoom. It's Sunday, a week before Purim, and I think we're all sort of going through our last-minute preparations. If you're from Jerusalem, you might be thinking, like, what day is Purim exactly? What do I do on each day? You might be wondering what costume you'll be wearing, if you are even going to see any people, and if you're not, then why wear a costume at all? Should you only be wearing a costume sort of from the belt up, because that's what people will see on Zoom? Or maybe you've already been vaccinated twice, and you'll have a chance to see real people, which that in itself might feel like v'nahafochu, as if the world is upside down, to be suddenly with people. We are celebrating a year since COVID has entered our life here in Jerusalem. And I think there's no better way to celebrate that than to go back into the topsy-turvy world of the Megillah, and try and understand what secrets can we uncover for our own lives this year. I'm really glad that Dov Abramson is here joining me today. Good evening, Dov.
Hi, everybody. Good evening.
And Dov is in Katamon, I'm in Talpiot. We're each in our homes, but we feel doubly at home because we are really, it's a real privilege to be here as part of Bet Avichai's Zooms. And what we're going to be doing today is talking about Esther's Many Masks, Jewish art and the Megillah. And both for Dov and for myself, it's especially meaningful to do this here at a Bet Avichai production because we've both been beneficiaries in different ways of the vision of Zalman Bernstein, of Mem Bernstein, and of the leadership of the Avichai Foundation, and now of Beit Avichai, and thinking about what can Jewish culture look like for Israel in the 21st century, and how much the richness of the tradition can be brought to life in contemporary Jewish living. And a big part of that vision for us was sort of manifest by a project that I was very proud to take part of, Tamar just mentioned, which is in his new Israeli commentary on Megillat Estelle, part of a series edited by our teacher, Avigdor Shinan, Professor Shinan, who for years has been working with the Avichai Foundation, in trying to think about what does Jewish civilization look like? How do we read ancient Jewish texts in new ways? In this book, the Megillah itself, we both added a textual commentary, but one of my favorite parts of creating this Megillah together with Professor Shinan was the visual element. And here we turn to Dov Abramson's studio, who worked together with the foundation in creating all the books in the series, starting with Pirkei Avot, the book of Yonah, and moving on to the 5 different scrolls, and trying to ask what kind of visual language can we add to the story of the Megillah today. And that is the journey that we're going to be taking you through today. We're going to be studying together 4 different moments of the Megillah and looking at the art of the Megillah from different moments in Jewish history. And as we're doing that, we can't see your faces, but we can see your texts. And so feel free to ask questions and write chats throughout the session. We're going to have a few questions for you as well that we'll ask you to fill out in the chat. And just as a starter, I would love for those who are willing to participate, if you could write in the chat, if you have your favorite edition of the Megillah. Growing up, maybe you had a visual copy of the Megillah, maybe you had an artist's rendition of the Megillah, maybe you just love the actual Megillah scroll. You're welcome to write in the chat and ask and suggest us sort of and share with everyone here what version of the Megillah did you love growing up? And we'll take a minute as you're writing your own answers, which hopefully we'll all be able to see. You can write this to panelists and attendees in the chat. I want to share my own story and then pass it over to Dov to also share some of his. And you'll see that really this is more of a conversation as we go throughout the night together. For me, my favorite edition of the Megillah is the one created by Jewish artist and calligrapher Arthur Shikh. Sheikh, who was born in Poland and moved to France and eventually fled the Holocaust and moved to America, where he died not too long after World War II, has a really rich and beautiful rendition of Megillat Esther, which is full of both calligraphy and fonts that he designed for himself for the Megillah, and also pictures. And one of the pictures that always tantalized me as a young boy reading through the Megillah was a picture where he drew himself into the Megillah. drawing the Megillah and writing as a sofer stam, writing the Megillah just as Haman is being hung. We're going to get to that image, so I don't want to spoil it for you now. We're going to get to that later on tonight, but I'm looking forward to that. And I think for me, that was really a moment when I saw how much what the Talmud describes of Esther is at the basis of the Megillah. I'm referring to the place where the Talmud says that Esther amra lachachamim kitvuni ledorot, where Esther says to the wise men, to the chachamim, write me for the generations. And what Esther is asking is, she's asking us to write her story down and to celebrate her story and to read her story so that it can continue to be celebrated and remembered by Jews for generations. But the way Jews remember is not by just retelling history. The way Jews remember is by retelling their own lives weaved in to the ancient stories. That's how Jewish memory works, and we know it from Passover, we know it from Yom Kippur, we know it from Chanukah, and we know it especially I think from Purim. So how did Esther's living will, ethical will to us to write her for the generations, not just so that the generations remember, but so that the generations write themselves and also draw themselves through the story of Estelle? That's part of what we're going to be looking at today, and that's what Arthur Shikh did. That was my spoiler alert for what we'll see in about 45 minutes. Dov, over for you. Any favorite childhood memories of Purim?
Well, yeah, I have a few early memories. I think one of my first memories is actually a set of puppets that I had as a kid. Before we made Aliyah, I was probably maybe 6 or 7. I'm not even sure they were puppets that were made as Megillah, as the Megillah people, as Mordechai and Esther and Haman, where they were converted to be them. But I remember that was when I realized that it's actually a theater. And I think we're going to touch on that as we go through this evening and see the different artistic renditions of the Megillah. We'll see that. My other very strong connection to the Megillah is actually not from the artistic point of view, is as a Baal Koreh. I am my other favorite thing in the world besides art is reading the Torah and the Megillot publicly, laning, as we call it in the Mamalashon. And I still do that. And the Megillah, of course, is one of the highlights of the year as a Baal Koreh. It's a theater. I do it in voices. And actually, a few years ago, I finally had a friend of mine, Julie Seltzer, who is a Soferet Stam, write a Megillah for me to read from, which I still read from every year. Unfortunately, last year was probably the first year in many years that I didn't read it, at least in a gathering setting because of COVID. But it's a very special Megillah. I actually did not think to bring it here, but it's a very special Megillah. It's very short. It takes the minimum of lines, which is the Aseret Bnei Haman, the 10 sons of Haman, which are 11 lines long, and the rest of the Megillah goes as those 11 lines. So it's an entire Megillah. It's very, very short, but very, very long. So I think those two loves of mine, the artistic part and the theater, the reading of it, the Hebrew of it, the music of it, the voices of it, that's what I take with me, and that's what I love about it.
So I think you really brought the full drama of how the Megillah is not just a text to be studied or a text to be drawn or illustrated, as we're going to see, but it's really a text to be performed. And I guess that's where we sort of want to start off today, in the fact that the Megillah is a performance. I know, Dov, could you share the presentation now?
Sure.
And part of what makes the Megillah a performance in such a good way is that it really is a participatory performance. And we know that in the basic sense of the way, every time Haman is mentioned, the whole audience is asked to join in. And there's a moment when you're sitting there hearing the Megillah and suddenly the whole audience erupts in noise at the sound of Haman, that you realize that this is not just a text to be recited and heard, it's a text to be performed. And that performance of the text is done by the entire community at the time. And just like we in this Zoom, we don't want to be just Dov and Mishael speaking to you. We want the whole audience to participate. So we're going to ask you a few times to write in the chat. So too in the Megillah, the whole audience is asked to participate in a really active way. And that element of theatricality of performance is also built into the Megillah itself. If you look behind me, and Dov, if you can move over to this next slide, one of the most beautiful Megillot I've ever seen is part of the Braginsky collection from Switzerland, created originally in a small town in France. where you can see the artist added in sort of the characters of the Megillah, but he added them in really as a kind of a theatrical performance, and is actually related to a specific theater in Lyon, if I'm not mistaken. But the illustrator here sort of captures the way it's a story being told, it's a theatrical story being told. But the truth is that Megillah itself is full of an imaginative and really a visual theatricality to it. If you read it, it reads like a play. Enter this, exit that. It's all very short texts, and it's full of production notes, designer notes in a way. And so when we created this Megillah, and really when you open, when we created this Megillah, the Israeli commentary, one of my first requests to Dov's team was that every chapter of the Megillah starts with its own gateway, its own visual entrance. And for chapter 1, we asked one of Dov's illustrators, Elad Lifshitz, to draw a map of Shushan. And this is very fitting because the Megillah itself starts with those exact words, right? Vayhi bimei Achashverosh, hu Achashverosh, hamolech mihodu ve'ad Kush, sheva ve'esrim u'mea medina. I can't help but perform it myself as we're going through this tonight. So the author of the Megillah is asking us, inviting us to imagine this amazing empire of 127 nations or countries. And I asked Elad, as you're drawing this, bring us into this land just the way the text is do it visually. And we immediately thought of the idea of creating a map in the way that, a young child opens up a book of fantasy or science fiction. And the first page, the inside cover, will be a map of this fantasy land. If you've ever opened The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, immediately you're dropped into this map, you're dropped into this world. And I think that's exactly what the author of the Megillah wants us to do as well. Dov, any thoughts on this image and on the next ones?
I think you hit the nail on the head here. I think it's the exposition. It's the visual exposition to where we're entering, where we're seeing. There's some. If you notice, the four corners are the four main characters of the Megillah. We have Esther and Haman, Mordechai, and Achashverosh. We have some clues, like little spoilers for what we're going to see. We have the Shlichim, a little play on words. The Shlichim is also a relay race, so they're sending. It's like the picture of a relay race here, and I think that's really what this is about. You're right. It's like the opening of a fantasy book. The next part of the exposition in the Megillah is, of course, the banquet, the first mishteh, the first banquet of Achashverosh, which lasted 180 days, 6 months. In Mishael and Avigdor Shinan's commentary, it said that probably most of the numbers in the Megillah are exaggerations. But let's try to imagine a 6-month banquet. And I want to show two different depictions of that banquet here. And by comparing them, maybe learn a little bit of what the artists who throughout the generation, it's very important for me to stress that we are going to cross continents and time back and forth. We're going to weave back and forth from 21st century to 20th century to 14th century. And we're not doing it in any chronological way or even in any kind of pedagogical way. We're going to experience the different ways that artists depict Jewish and non-Jewish, by the way, throughout the ages. And I think comparison is the best way to do that. Because when we see that the same text, and I do this many times with my students and in seminars, visual seminars that I give, is we are so text-oriented as a nation, as a culture. And even though we tend to say that Judaism is a little weak on visuals, that's really not the case. And you don't even have to dig that deep to find that many, many aspects of Jewish culture have been visualized really throughout time, since the birth of Judaism, and through every kind of community, country, and continent that you can imagine. So what we're going to try to do is sort of experientially look at these depictions, and without getting too much into the academic part of it, I'll try to give a little of historic background to the images, but I really want to talk about what we're looking at, because it's an exercise in sort of letting go of what we're so used to talking about, which is the commentary, which of course is important, and we're so used to that. So what we're going to try to do tonight is to sort of let go of that textual orientation and try to.
I'll do my best. I can't.
I know it's a tall order, but we're gonna try to do that. So what we have here are two very, very different from very different times and places. On the right, we have an unknown artist from the 16th or 17th century in Persia, who illuminated a text called the Ardashir Nama, which is a quasi Esther-based Jewish Persian text that tells a story that's a little different than the Megillah, but has many, many points that are similar. So we're looking here at Achashverosh, at the king, sitting in the middle, right? If anybody has, by the way, any ideas about what they see here, go ahead, okay? In the chat, I'll try to keep one eye on the chat as much as I can. So on the right, we have this banquet. If you notice, there are only men in this banquet, and we know that there were two separate banquets in the first chapter of Esther. There's the men's and the women's. And here we see only men, and it's quite an inviting banquet. It seems that everybody's very relaxed. The king is sort of sharing some kind of either food or drink with one of the participants in the banquet. And if we look on the left, we'll see Arthur Sheikh, who we've already mentioned. This is the first edition. Arthur Sheikh actually illustrated two Megillot, one in 1925 in Paris and one in 1950, that was published after he died only in 1974 in Israel. This one is from the first edition in Paris. And here we see a banquet that's a little different. The colors actually are extremely similar, which I find very interesting. And I even have an idea that maybe Sheikh was aware of these manuscripts. The colors are very, very similar. But Achashverosh is in a very different place. If you notice, the king Achashverosh is here on the left, way in the background. Okay, while in the Persian text, he's front and center. I think this has to do with Sheikh's thinking of authority. We'll get to that a little later. But Sheikh called himself a soldier of art. He had very strong ideas about liberation, about tyranny. And I think he wanted to put Achashverosh in the background. You'll also notice that there are women and men together in this banquet, which is not exactly what we read in the text, which is, we'll see all along in all these artists, that people and artists took certain liberties from the text. We have a very non-kosher animal being served, which also is based on a little bit of the Midrash. We have very angry looking people, I must say, which is different than the Persian rendition. People, it's very uninviting. Even the composition, which has a triangular look to it, and we'll talk about that triangle later this evening, everybody seems a little bit upset. And I think that's maybe has to do with what happens a little later with Vashti. We'll get to that in a minute. There are a lot of Persian symbols of royalty that we'll see here. And of course, the main feeling here is that grandeur that we're used to, that we read in the text, the that description of all the different types of textile that was there. And again, I think Sheikh expanded on what he saw in these early illustrations and illuminations, because they're hinted here, and here they're much more detailed because that was Sheikh's style. And I think it's a wonderful, wonderful piece here.
Dov, one of the someone is mentioning here in the chat, Menachem is mentioning here in the chat, that if you look at the Persian picture, you can really see people also from different sort of ethnic backgrounds, and maybe that's kind of part of the representation as well.
That's true.
And I want to add also that you mentioned the Chul, Karpas, V'tchelet that the Megillah gets into. They're really, the Tanakh in general is very sparse on descriptions, on visual descriptions. There's a famous piece by Auerbach about how, if you read Homer, in Ulysses, in the Odyssey, what every bird felt and looked like. But if you read the Akedah, you have no idea. Was it a bright day? Was it raining? Were there trees? Were they sweating? We don't know anything. The only place where the Tanakh breaks into vivid descriptions is when describing the Mikdash, the Mishkan, which is our Parashat Shavua, and the Mikdash in Sefer Melachim. And then the other place where suddenly we have descriptions are Megillat Esther. And of course, that leads the Midrash to say all kinds of things about how the connection between the Mikdash and Megillat Esther, or Megillat Esther is kind of describing the kelim shonim, the destruction of the temple on the back as a backdrop to Achashverosh's grandeur. But either way, I think that the tradition of Purim being a very visual and a very vivid and a very colorful holiday can be found in the DNA of the fact that the Megillah itself constantly makes us notice what are people wearing.
Right.
And we know that one of the things that really matters is at the end, what is Mordechai wearing?
Right.
At the beginning of the story, he's wearing sackcloth and ashes, but at the end of the story, he's wearing chul, karpas, utchelet, exactly the colors of the Persian Empire. So there's kind of an element of, if you follow what people are wearing in the Megillah, you know where you are in the plot.
Yes. Francine mentions here in the chat that there's also a piece of open land here on the upper left, which is very, very much more of a modern take. In the illuminations here, it's a very closed environment. That's also very interesting. Something that's looking further away, a gaze towards, it's actually the back, which I find interesting also.
So let's launch into our 4 scenes. We chose 4 scenes from the Megillah. There's so much to uncover here. And we're going to look at Vashti, at Mordechai, at Esther, and of course at Haman. Let's start off with Vashti. So here, really the story of Vashti is something that I think in the last 150 years, as we're nearing a world where men and women can be equal and can return to their reality of Genesis chapter 1 of Bereshit, where Zachar u'Nekeva bara otam, we have a new way of evaluating Vashti's behavior. But for generations, Vashti was the evil queen, the precursor to Esther. If Esther was all about loyalty, Vashti was all about saying no and denial. But the truth is that both Vashti and Esther also have a lot of connections between them. We wanted to focus on that moment where Vashti says no, and with 3 pictures in it. So Dov, what's the first picture you chose for us?
This is a image from Shlomo Katz, an illustrator and artist, and I love this. This is one of my favorite scenes depicted from Megillah. What we see here is really very interesting. Vashti is here on the bottom left, and she is saying no. She's leaning a little bit forward, while everybody, or a little bit back. She's sort of standing straight with her hands saying no. She's accompanied by what seems to be an African servant, which is something unfortunate Orientalism is all over Megillah depictions. We saw a little bit of it. I didn't want to mention it in Sheikh, but we'll talk about it a little later, where a lot of Orientalism, meaning European or Western ideas and even visuals, find their way into Persia just because that's what the artists and the readers knew. But what happens here is, look at this composition. It's almost like an Escher. It's almost like an Escher drawing. It goes round and round. You have Vashti saying no to a servant who was sent by Achashverosh, who's up here. The gestures are beautiful. The servant is saying, "Come up, you got to come up." The Achashverosh is calling. You can mamash see him saying that, and she's saying no. Achashverosh is sort of peeking down from this open balcony where he can look and even see, if not Vashti, then her servant. And these 3 dudes are amazed that somebody's actually not listening to the king, and that it's taking time for Vashti to make her way up. Now they're beautiful. This is also up my alley because it's very graphic. It's very flat and graphically depicted, which is sort of my discipline. So we see carved into the stairwell, we see a Persian element, architectural element. We see peacocks, which are a very strong motif in Persian culture. And what's amazing is that the peacocks are doing the same thing that the people are doing. The peacock that's next to the servant is giving the stink eye, the bad look to Vashti, who's saying no. And Vashti's peacock is saying no. Vashti actually's mouth is closed. She's not saying anything. But you can almost hear the squawking of this peacock saying no, she doesn't want to go up. And I think it's just an amazing composition where everybody's doing something and it goes round and round and round. And my favorite little addition here is this little dog on the bottom. A dog in classic painting and art is always, yes, as Francine writes, her hand is saying no, but her mouth isn't saying anything. That's true. There's a lot of body language. That's probably the best term to use here. There's tons of body language in this picture. And the dog is looking up at Vashti. The dog in most classic art is a symbol of loyalty. And I think the dog is here, it's not a coincidence. It's all about where Vashti's loyalty is. So I think that's also a little nice addition right here.
I have to say, I mean, I'm just noticing this now. We looked at this picture together already a few times, but noticing the vine, the grapevine growing from the bottom and coming up and snaking all the way up behind Achashverosh and almost to his cup, right, which he's holding. It's kind of very clear that the vine is actually controlling Achashverosh, controlling the narrative. So Vashti is the one, she's the sober one saying, no, everyone else is drunk. And she literally stops the servant mid-step. I mean, he's almost tripping off the stairwell.
We'll see that the wine is given, different artists hand the cup of wine to different characters in the Megillah as we go along.
So if you go to the next picture here, what do you see here? You combined two different pictures from different traditions.
So here's another little comparison that I wanted to give. Otto Geismar was a Jewish artist and illustrator who lived in pre-war Germany and escaped from Germany to Brazil and then later settled in England. And he has a Haggadah and he has a Megillat Esther. And his style is also very much up my sensibilities. He does a lot of graphic work, one color, black ink. And what I love about this depiction of Vashti's banquet is that it seems like a sisterhood. We're used to thinking, especially if we learned the Midrashim of the Megillah, we're used to thinking of Vashti as somebody really evil, something really bad and seedy and decadent happening at that banquet. Nothing good. Everything was like very dark. And here, Geismar shows us a group of women who are very attentive to what Vashti has to say. Vashti's here. She's dressed just a little bit nicer than everybody else, than the other women, but all the women are very attentive. Everything seems very wholesome. It looks like she's saying something smart, interesting, surprising. Everybody's gaze is to her. You'll see this servant here is turning towards her. These two, I don't know if they're part of the banquet or servants, are serving these. Everybody has the same. There's something very sisterhood about it. Everybody is wearing the same necklace, and she's saying something that seems to be substantial. That seems to be of importance. And I just love that because it's so opposite from what I've always imagined of Vashti's banquet being something that, we don't want to really look at that. Something really, really bad is going on there. And I love that. The lower image here is actually an image that I created, a piece that I created. I was invited in 2015, about 6 years ago, I was invited to participate in a exhibition at the Sheikh Gallery in Tel Aviv, the theme of the exhibition, it took place around Purim time, was Vashti, was the character of Vashti, who Vashti is. And as we know, Vashti, if you read the pshat, if you read just the verses from Megillat Esther, she really didn't do anything bad in what we consider biblically bad. She actually was the first woman or the only woman in the Bible, we like to say, who stood up to a man. People, that's. And a lot of, Michelle could probably speak this better than me, that was picked up on through the feminist movements and saw Vashti as a positive symbol of women empowerment. So when I was invited to participate, I felt very strange about it because I felt, how can I? The entire exhibit was from a feminist point of view. Most of the artists were women, and I felt very uncomfortable trying to get into those shoes, so to speak. So I looked for a male perspective on the Vashti story, and it dawned on me that the people who actually fired Vashti was a board of executives, 7 executives who were sitting on the council, on Achashverosh's council, and they're all men, and they have very cool, funny, maybe parody-based names called Shena, Shetar, Admata, Tarshish, Meres, Marsenai, Memuchan. The Midrash says that Memuchan, the last one, is the same person as Mehuman, who is the same as Haman. And I thought that's probably the only perspective that I can give in a natural and an authentic way. Talking about 7 faceless men who actually give the verdict on Vashti. And I think that's very apropos, maybe even a little bit ahead of the Me Too time, on where the power is and who's making the decisions. As Francine wrote here, there are midrashim about these 7 people, that each of them had a certain role in Achashverosh's court. most of them actually sort of maintenance and kitchen work, different parts of the kitchen, different parts of the back of the boiler room, so to speak, of Achashverosh's court. And there's also a correlation with the 7 days of the week and a lot of astrology involved, but I don't really want to go into that right now. But the idea was here to show those seven. So I thought that putting this and Geismar's women across each other is an interesting way of seeing how here there's 7 people that are standing frontally in front of you. And here the women who are, there's something more dynamic and more interesting happening there. While this is like a stone-faced board that that fired Vashti.
So we have one last Vashti slide, and here we want to ask all of you, our participants, just take a look at these 2 images, separated by about 100 years between them. 2 images of Vashti, one before she is deposed and one after. Any thoughts before Dov launches into his analysis of what's going on in these pictures?
Don't be shy. There are no wrong answers. We're in the artistic realm. It's interesting. Okay, so I'll say a few words here. On the right hand, we have a beautiful, beautiful Megillah. I really, I don't know if it's easy to get to acquire, to purchase, but I think it's one of the most beautiful pieces of art that have been done on Jewish text in the past 20 years by J.T. Waldman, a contemporary of mine, who is a cartoonist, a real very, very talented artist and caricaturist, comics. And he did an entire Megillah in the style that you're looking at the right, and it's really mind-blowing in my mind. And I'm going to jump to the left for a second. On the left, we have, of course, something from a different time, from the late 19th century, by Ernest Normand, who's a British painter, an Orientalist painter, very classic composition. You can see the right, the triangular composition that I talk about that always has a drama. It's a low triangle. I hope you're following the triangle that you can see that I'm making here. And to me, this is a big chidush when I learned about. It was very new to me when I saw this image for the first time of Queen Vashti deposed, because I always assumed that she was expelled. We always talk about, I even called this chapter the expulsion of Vashti. I assumed that she was thrown out of the palace. That's at least what I always imagined. And when I saw this, and that's why art sometimes is so powerful, I realized that that's not necessarily the case. He probably kept her in the palace, but she was deposed from being the queen. And if you read the verses, that actually makes sense. So what I see here is a teenager who was sent to her room, basically. And maybe I'm talking as a father
of teenagers, right?
Yes, a teenager girl.
You're the
but my daughter's room doesn't look like this. It's cleaner. It's actually much more misudah.
It's funny, Dov, a few people here commented that the pictures that they feel like she actually feels liberated. She's like holding her head like, oh my God, thank God I was saved from that guy.
Right, exactly. Mamash. And as some people wrote here, absolutely. She looks relieved. She looks relaxed. Again, we have the African servant here. I'm not sure exactly what she's doing. Maybe she's relieved also. Maybe she thinks she's going to be out of a job. I'm not sure. There's a lot of Orientalism here. A lot of these fruit bowls. I don't think that was Persian cuisine. I can't be sure about that, but I wouldn't think. What I find interesting, and that's why I jumped from Waldman back to Normand, is that I'm sure that JT, who did a lot of research, visual research on the Megillah, was aware of this piece of art. It's a pretty well-known piece of art. And I think JT, what he did here is he almost clothed her in the same clothes. Maybe it was something a little modern, a little bit, but I think he's depicting the moment before that, when she's on the right, when she's confident, when Vashti is having her banquet, when everything's going well. And the moment after is what Normand is showing here. And I think it's a beautiful movement from one moment to the next. And I think the Megillah is full of those moments of nafochu. where it's a topsy. Michelle used the term topsy-turvy in the beginning. It's always going back and forth. People are on the top and then they're on the bottom. And I think when I look at these two, even these compositions and these images next to each other, it seems like Vashti's on top and Vashti's on the bottom, and maybe she's okay with that. That's what I see here.
I just want to add one thing, two comments about Vashti. One is what you mentioned, Dov, about Vashti maybe, being deposed, but not slaughtered or executed, as the Midrash says necessarily, right? Asher lo tavo Vashti od el hamelech. She isn't killed. She's actually sort of banished from seeing the king, but she doesn't stop being his wife. So she's basically an aguna. And it's interesting because in recent years, there's been a tradition of marking an Aguna day on Ta'anit Esther, but I never saw that they actually connected that to the idea of Vashti actually in a way of being the first Aguna. And I think just to say two more things in Vashti's, to praise Vashti, one is that the Megillah itself doesn't necessarily see Vashti in a bad light. And we know that because the word that she uses to refuse the king is the word vatema'en. And the other story in which we have mi'un, where someone says vayema'en, is Yosef saying no to Eshet Potiphar. And we know that Mordechai and Esther are considered sort of, continuing the path of Yosef as the descendants of Binyamin, all descendants of the daughter of Rachel. And here too, Vashti is wrapped into this idea. So we have two traditions. We have the Midrashic tradition of Vashti being evil, being the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, being someone who persecuted Jews. And we have a tradition hinted at in the Megillah itself of Vashti actually being connected to the story of Yosef and Binyamin and the children of Rachel. So there's a tension even in the earliest levels of Vashti. Okay, so we started with the theatrical element of the Megillah and the very vivid beginning. We moved into Vashti. Now let's get going on Mordechai on the horse. Two things as we enter the story of Mordechai. We're not looking at the text as Dov challenged us so much. We're looking what the pictures can teach us as a midrash on the text. I have to say, Dov, I think we need to get on a bit more of a we need to be faster on our horses, looking at the time. But just to say that the image of Mordechai on the horse is perhaps one of the oldest images of the Megillah. And we'll see at the end, really the oldest image that we have of Megillat Esther, where again, Mordechai is on the horse. But it's important to understand that the Megillah is written on a backdrop of exile, of galut, and of Jewish disempowerment, of Jewish lack of sovereignty. And therefore, the fact that Mordechai can ride a horse is perhaps the greatest image of Jewish power that Jews for centuries could imagine. I mean, to a large extent, in Muslim countries and Christian countries, there were often times when Jews were not allowed to ride horses. And so this idea of one day a year we get to be al-hasus, as you say in Hebrew, right? We're on the horse, is really epitomizes so much of the element of what's exciting about Mordechai. So what's this first picture that you chose for us, Dov?
Okay, so this is an illustration by Moshe Mizrahi, whose nickname was Shah. An amazing artist who was born in Tehran and came to Israel in the late 19th century, and this is from the early 20th century. He made these big posters, also very graphic, very illustrative, and he has one that tells a large part of the Megillah story. And in the top left corner, he has this image of Mordechai on the horse with the crown, Ateret Zahav Gedolah, as it says in the verse. But he has somebody leading the horse, and I think there's a little bit of a mix. It's a little bit of misnomer here. There's the part where Mordechai at the end of the Megillah comes out from the king wearing malchut, and he quotes that pasuk here, Mordechai yatza lifnei melech bilvush malchut. And here it says Rochev al-Asus, which actually is not part of that verse, because I think what Shah did here is he mixed it with the story of Haman taking Mordechai through the streets, and they're all dressed in Ottoman Empire attire, soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, because that's what Moshe Mizrahi knew. And as we see, it's always part of what was known at the time. That was the regal, that was the royal dress and garb of the time. So that's what the artist put on the people. And I think that's a very basic concept, but I think it just makes it amazing to see throughout the years.
People are asking here about the clock. We got a few comments about the clock. Any thoughts on?
Oh, I thought they meant that we should watch the clock about our time. I looked at it and I have no idea. I really tried to think about what that is. I don't know what the time was. I couldn't find anything, any commentary about that. This
picture in creating the book, I also tried to find out. I know two things. I know that Moshe Mizrahi was sort of the home artist of Bet Knesset Zoharei Chama, which is the synagogue on Rehov Yafo, right next to the Shikh, a synagogue that famously has a sundial on its front. And maybe that has some sort of connection. I think also the Persian Empire was the empire of modernity of its time, right? They had a bureaucracy system, they had mail, international mail, they had a really sort of an international trade. And in the same way, he's now drawing the Ottoman Empire, which to a large extent had pretty similar borders almost at the time. And I think that there too, the Ottoman Empire represents modernity and the clock represents modernity. So this idea of maybe the empire connection to modernity and to technology might be here as well, but that's just an uneducated guess. Let's move on to the next two pictures.
Okay, a brief comparison between two other depictions of the same scene. I think, as Michelle said, it's sort of the nutshell of the Megillah. That scene of the three people, usually Haman, Mordechai, and the horse. Actually, it's not three people; it's three images, three beings that we see in that composition. So on the left side, we have an unknown artist from the Jesselson Megillah, which is a Megillah that was probably written and illuminated in Amsterdam in the 18th century. Also, as Michelle said, it's all about sovereignty. And Amsterdam in the 18th century was full of anusim, of people who had come from Portugal to Amsterdam to live a life that was free, that they were free to practice their religion. And they apparently, as a community, commissioned a Megillah to be written and illuminated in order to manifest that sovereignty and those possibilities. And it wasn't a coincidence that it's Esther, because that's all what it's about. It's about the empowerment of the Jewish people in a foreign land. So in this depiction of Mordechai on the horse and Haman taking them through the city square, there's a very famous midrash. One of the midrashim that you learn in kindergarten is that Vashti, Haman's wife Zeresh and his daughter were in the window looking at this procession, and his daughter thought that, of course, the person with the crown must be Haman, or at least Haman, or maybe Achashverosh, and the person drawing the horse, it must be Mordechai. So she threw a waste bucket on his head, and I think this is an amazing depiction of that. Where actually, I always imagine that the waste bucket. Arc. Yeah, she actually threw the waste bucket, not only the contents of the waste bucket. I never even imagined that that's a possibility. I always thought that she just, threw it, but she actually threw it. So, and it's I find that very, just interesting to see. And on the right, we have Elona Frankel, who's very well known in Israel for doing children's book. Sira Sirim is her big hit. And she also illustrated a book called the Book of the Chagim, Book of Holidays. And I love this little depiction of the same procession for a few reasons. Because Haman just looks a little bit upset. He doesn't look like, he's not angry. We always were used to Haman being this really nasty person. And it just looks like he's a little bit miffed about the situation. And Mordechai, who's not really wearing a crown or garb, he's just a Jewish guy on a horse, and I love that. And Zeresh and the daughter, for some very strange reason, seem sort of okay. Maybe they don't realize who's who. They're not throwing anything. And I just like how, even though it's not really maybe true to the text in terms of what Mordechai is wearing, and the horse doesn't have no fancy. And the other and the crowds. Notice how the crowds here in this very, very minimalist depiction here by Elona Frankel. And in the Amsterdam Megillah, how there's a bunch of people looking through here. And another interesting element here is the Persian rug that Elona Frankel uses on Zeresh's garment, on the horse, and on Haman. And that's something that the Persian rug, I think Michelle could probably speak better to this. The Persian rug in Israeli culture. That's what we knew about Persia. Maybe Michelle you can say a word about that.
I mean, I think that we now think of Iran and Persia in the context of the Muslim revolution there, and it's threatening us. But in the 70s, which is when these pictures were made, Iran is a good friend of Israel and a great way to buy wonderful rugs. So she's sort of, again, as we said, Esther is being written for the generations always through the images of the time. Let's skip ahead, Dov, to Esther's party. It's time to have a little drink.
Okay.
I think the height of the drama of the book of Esther happens in chapter 7, where Esther has for the second time invited Haman and the king to her house. And part of what's worth noting is how Esther becomes a queen. And so much of how she becomes a queen is noted in the text. Just notice how many times Esther Hamalka is mentioned here, right? Esther Hamalka. Esther Hamalka. Achashverosh is making a big deal out of the fact that Esther has power. She has a crown. She is the queen. And that is also the challenge that Mordechai gave her. Umi yodea im le'et kazot higat lamalchut. And I think part of the power of the Megillah is that lehagia lamalchut is not just when externally you are chosen, but when internally you fill the position. So Esther in chapter 7 is someone who really internally has filled the position. And I asked Dov to add this picture. It's really one of my favorite pictures because it goes not to chapter 7 where she's hosting, we'll get to there in a second, but to chapter 5, just after Mordechai charged her to go to the king. And she says no, and then eventually she says yes, but she does something very special when she says yes to Mordechai. She doesn't tell him what she's going to do. She tells him to fast. She tells him to congregate all the Jewish community, but she doesn't tell him her plan. And then she goes to the king, and we know that when she goes, the king could kill her for entering, or he could give her the scepter, and he does end up giving her the scepter. But the artist here, John Millay, chooses a moment before she enters. She's standing behind the curtain, and she's about to enter the king. And notice she has one hand sort of on these beads, a pearl swash holding her hair. And it looks like she's about to take that off and sort of ruffle her hair out. And on the other hand, she's holding the crown, which isn't on her head, suggesting to us as the viewers to wonder, is she Esther? Is she the queen? Is she going to enter as a temptress? Is she going to recreate the first time Achashverosh saw her and fell in love with her? Or is she going to enter as the queen? And in the tradition of beautiful cloths, the badim of Megillat Esther, Millay chooses two very significant cloths. The first one is the blue of the British Empire, the blue of the Windsor family. And this picture, in fact, is hung up in Windsor Castle to this day. And second of all, he chooses a coat that was given by a Chinese emperor to one of the British kings, and it hangs, I think, in the National Gallery. But the coat he draws is inside out. And if you look at what's on the coat, you can really see how, it's this golden coat, and there are these blue and red things. And actually what it is it's dragons. It's these Chinese dragons, but it's the inside of it, where when you turn a embroidery inside out, and you'll see just these lines. And I think there's something very significant about the kind of inside out element that Millay is choosing here, and something about the way in which inside and outside, externality and internality play a role. Going back to Esther, is Esther the queen when she's the queen externally, or is she the queen when she's the queen internally? So that's my favorite picture. Dov, what do you have to say about Esther and the banquet?
I'm gonna compare again to two similar, and actually from similar times. It's also an interesting exercise to take two artists from around the same time, both from Amsterdam or the Netherlands in the mid 17th century. One on the left we have Rembrandt, who's very famous painting of Achashverosh and Haman at the Feast of Esther. Very intimate, just the three of them, or at least that's what we see in the light. Esther, the light is very much on Esther. Each of the people are holding one object. Esther is very hard to, if somebody in the chat happens to know something about the painting, I was unable to discern exactly what she's holding there. It seems like a vessel of some sort. Achashverosh is definitely holding the scepter, the sharvit, which plays a role throughout the Megillah. And Haman is drinking wine, which is interesting. He's the one drinking wine, and he already seems a little down. This is the banquet where, just to remind everybody, this is the banquet where Esther reveals Haman's plan. This is probably maybe a moment before, just as it's happening. It's hard to tell exactly what moment this is. Achashverosh is gazing kind of towards Haman, but Haman has his head down. He's not really, his expression, doesn't have much of an expression. And Esther also is looking down. There's not a lot of eye contact there. What there is by the artist is a symbolic depiction of Esther's royalty by having that robe take up so much of the frame. There's a very, very, very obvious triangle happening here, where Achashverosh actually is on top at this moment, at least. On the right, we have a very different depiction of the same scene. It never dawned on me that there was a crowd at the banquet. I always imagined it as an intimate affair. But here it's happening inside, even though we have Chatzar, Ginat, Bitan, Amelech. What exactly does that mean? Is that an inside or outside? I don't know if it's Tav Sagol, if it's COVID friendly or not. How much of this is actually an outside or inside scene? This one seems very much inside. And Achashverosh actually here looks pretty drunk, and the wine is in front of him. And as Mishael said about what we saw with Vashti, the artist seemed to imply that that's part of who he was. He was drunk, and a lot of his decisions were made under that, in that state. Haman is already looking away. This may be Haman niv'at milifnei hamelech v'hamalka. Haman was sort of terrified. He's looking the other way. He's not getting up, but he's looking the other way. Esther is sort of grasping herself. And it seems that this is already the dramatic moment where the revelation has happened. From the left side, behind the stair, it's only women, from this side up, from this diagonal part here. There's a little bit of outside gaze towards, and there's a bunch of people from different ethnicities on the right. There's actually a crowd to this scene. And of course, that very Orientalism, there's a peeled lemon here, which I don't think was Persian cuisine. But what I love here is the difference in the intimacy of the thing. There's something very, very intimate happening with Rembrandt, and Jan Steen shows something more of a theater in front of people. If you have insights to that, my friends, your objects are Esther's feet.
It's worth adding that, as Professor Shalom Sabar has shown, the golden age of Amsterdam is a real moment when suddenly the artists are very intensely curious about the story of Esther, not just the artists, also the politicians, the playwrights, the publicists. The story of Esther as a way of revolting against an evil king, and more importantly, against an evil vizier, is really the way the Dutch saw their battle against the Spanish, and this really battle of Catholics and Protestants. So here is Esther fighting for freedom of religion in a Protestant way against an evil Catholic king. And that brings us to the discussion of a little bit of evil through the hanging of Haman. So I think there's something very dark in Megillat Esther. And the darkness is clear, the violence is there. We don't notice it because it's part of this sort of carnivalesque element of the Megillah until suddenly we grow up and we're aware of, wait, what are we celebrating here exactly? Why are we so happy that so many people were killed? And yes, this is a justified battle for self-survival and for protection. But on the other hand, didn't we take it too far? And on the third hand, does it all matter? Let's just get drunk and celebrate it. This is just one big fantasy. And those three voices, the ethical self-protection narrative, the careful, maybe we use too much power, and the third, the carnivalesque, all sort of mix in the pictures that we're going to see right now. So Dov, take us to the next image.
Okay.
What's going on here?
Mordechai Gerstein, who I was not aware of before we worked on the book, Michelle, and it was worth it almost for a few artists here. It was worth knowing. An American artist, Jewish, our artist and illustrator. I'm sure people here from the States probably are more aware of his work than I was before I met it through Megillat Esther. What he did here is actually, this is an earlier scene. I cheated a little bit on this. It's from the scene of the building of the tree. It's not the hanging of Haman.
Family fun. It's like very
Right.
good poor
So
family
it's Haman and his wife taking their 10 kids, their 10 boys, on a project, on an outdoor project to build a tree to hang Mordechai. And there's something so playful about it where he's sort of sticking it to them as they're working on it. They're already falling in their own trap. One is hanging, one is under. It's just, there's really not much that I have to say here. It's just like I wanted to share with the people, because it shows a scene that doesn't even appear in the Megillah really, it's an extension of it. So it's a visual midrash. It's imagining. That's what I love about the potential in Jewish visuals is to fill in the blanks, because that's what midrash does. So unless I'm unaware of a midrash of the 10 sons of Haman, maybe I'm unaware. But yes, this is from the Queen Esther as Morning Star. That's where it's from. Someone asked here. Oh, I see. I'm not sure what the reference is. It's a children's book. He wrote. I couldn't get hold of the entire book, right, but exactly. Mordechai wrote and illustrated an entire book about Esther that's called Queen Esther, the Morning Star.
To just explain is that in the tradition, Esther means star in Persian, right? The goddess Ishtar, but probably more just the same Persian word we use in English today, the word representing star. And for the same reason, the Perek Tehillim connected to Esther is Lamenatzeach al Ayelet HaShachar, right? Ayelet HaShachar is the morning star. She is Venus. And so this tradition really connects very strongly into the Western tradition of Venus rising, the morning star, Esther, Ayelet HaShachar, and really the redemption as the stars before the sunrise. So this is all connected.
Just noticed that Haman is wearing a Hamantashen as a hat. And yes, as Sharon writes here, his wife does look like a wicked witch, as Zeresh. I just love this. I think it's playful. I mean, it's a little creepy, but it's playful, and it's very interesting.
Dov, just to say as a side comment, as you get excited about Mordechai Gerstein, he's famous, among other things, for being the director of the Bernstein Bears specials on NBC.
But he's not the illustrator.
And the Christmas tree or something like that.
But he's not the original illustrator of the Bernstein Bears.
No, he's definitely not the original illustrator. No, but he animated them into real life. Let's jump forward. I want to make a few comments. We're getting towards the end of the Megillah here and the end of our session. But I mentioned the question of violence in Megillat Esther, and the truth is that artists as well were not afraid to depict the violence in certain ways, but always with a twist. Here are two examples. One of the oldest pictures, really a illumination on a manuscript, the Leipzig Haggadah. It draws a picture as part of Vahi B'Chatzi Halayla, the piyut at the end of the Haggadah. It draws a picture of Haman on the tree. And here you have Haman and his 10 sons and his wife at the bottom crying. But really what's going on here is this is a riff over a famous Christian depiction called the Tree of Yishai, Geza Choter Yishai, the Tree of Jesse, where Jesus is described together with the 10 generations before him. And here as kind of a joke or as a tension with the Christian narrative, the hanging of Haman. And there's always been a very strong connection between the story of the hanging of Haman and the crucifying of Jesus. In Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, it's the same word. Vayitlu et Haman is also the tliyah of Yeshu. So there's a kind of a deep, dark history here of Jews using Purim to make fun of Christianity, a tradition that got them in trouble very often as well. On the other side, from a different side of the globe, a Megillat Esther that belonged to the Sassoon family, drawn in India. And here you actually see two sides fighting, including, interestingly, men and women on both sides. But it's not really clear who are the good guys and who the bad guys are. Maybe the good guys are in pink and the bad guys are in yellow. Maybe not. It's kind of unclear. And there's no distinction between them. It's just kind of war is war is war. Just a very interesting description here. Let's move on.
This is a very powerful part. This was the spoiler that Michelle gave when we began. This is Arthur Schick. On the right side, we have Arthur Schick's second edition of the Megillah that he illustrated when he was living in the States in 1950, and was published, as I said, after his death in 1974 in Israel. And in a very powerful statement at at the verse, at the point of the Megillah where Haman is hanged, Arthur Sheikh puts himself in the Haggadah. That's his self-portrait of him, and he has a Hamantashen, an Ozen Haman, in his hand, and he's writing the words Hanifra le'amo Yisrael mikol tzarehem, which is from the blessing that we say after we finish reading the Megillah. You want to translate, Misha? Help me translate that for a second.
He redeemed his nation of Israel from all who
oppress them,
oppress them, I guess. Yes.
And this depiction here of Haman is, you can't say it's exactly Hitler, but it is definitely a depiction of a Nazi. It's full of Nazi symbols, and it's really some sort of triumph, I guess. It's a little hard to call that a triumph, but it's Sheikh's response to his viewing and seeing the Holocaust, seeing the Shoah years. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, Sheikh was a political cartoonist and illustrator. I really urge you to look him up and see things that he did throughout the years. A lot, very, very political, very anti-establishment, very anti-tyranny, very much about liberty. I would say there's a lot of American and Judaism that plays into what he does. Mishael, if you want to say a few words about that, and then speak about the Purim at Landsberg.
I think that one thing that always captured my imagination here, as I said at the beginning, is that Sheikh draws himself into his own Megillah. And I think in that way, we usually try to create a distance between ourselves and the text, the distance between ourselves and our illustrations. But here Sheikh is saying, I am part of the story. By drawing the story, I am part of the story. I too am a character in the story. And I think that's such a basic element of Jewish memory and of Jewish holidays. We know it from the Haggadah Shel Pesach, another favorite holiday in the Zion family, where we are told that we need to see ourselves as if we ourselves left Egypt. And here, Sheikh is saying, I see myself as if I myself was rescued from Haman, and I was rescued from Haman by surviving the Holocaust. And he draws, as you mentioned, Haman as this sort of SS officer with the skull and bones in the middle, the SS Totenkampf, the skull and bones there, and the swastikas. But more than that, he draws himself as winning and beating him because he can continue to tell the story. And not only tell the story, but also sort of anachronistically eat an Ozen Haman, right? So we see these sort of images of the way Jewish storytelling takes place. And I love this Ozen Haman partly because we're aware that it's just a German cookie. But it's a German cookie that we decided to tell a certain Jewish story about, and now it has a new meaning. So it really says something about the way culture and Jewish culture works. It's never about some originalism. It's always about a constantly living story. The story of Megillat Esther is never finished being written. Estelle told us to write it for the generations, and we keep writing it again and again. And that's the point that I want to end with three very quick points. One is, if we're speaking about Holocaust stories in the Landsberg displaced persons camp, the DP camp, the head of the camp in Purim 1946 noticed that everyone was just severely depressed. And he decided in January 1946 that he was going to challenge all the members of the camp to put on a Purim celebration that no one would ever forget, at which time they would also give a good Jewish funeral to Hitler. And so here are three images. One is of a sign quoting a famous Hitler speech that he said in 1945, saying, Jews will never have Purim again. Jeden werden kein Purim nicht haben. They're not going to have Purim again. Here we are a year later, we have Purim. And a special reading of the Megillah that took place where someone put on his garb from the Dachau concentration camp, which he still had. And finally, a funeral, a burial that they created for Hitler. And you can see the swastika on the grave and the swastika on Sheikh's picture. And it's the way in which Jews create the new memories and write for generations again and again.
On a personal note, I'd like to say that when I wasn't aware of the story of Landsberg, and I realized that recreating my own family's history, that at that same year and that same Purim, my own grandparents were at a DP camp not far from there in Germany, in Feldafing. My mother, who's actually here with us tonight, was born in that DP camp. And I could just imagine the power that went through that camp when this was done. The power, but also I think the sadness. I mean, I can't imagine that they felt very empowered there, but probably just enough to pull this off. And I really, it hit me like a ton of bricks when I realized that this is something that isn't just a black and white picture in a Megillah that I'm designing. It's very similar to something that happened in my own family.
Amazing. So let's end. We wanted to end with the following note. Esther is always been really deeply entwined into Jewish art. And the first place where Esther was entwined into Jewish art is in the oldest synagogue, painted synagogue that we have found from the year 244 in Syria, the Dura Europos synagogue. And here, right by the ark, is a picture of the Esther story. And in fact, Esther is the one character closest to the Torah ark. So even though Megillat Esther is a strange book, it's the last book of the Bible, it's the most non-religious book of the Bible, it doesn't mention the land of Israel. And so here's a community in Syria that says, when we create our synagogue, the biblical character we want closest to our Sefer Torah is Esther. If you can move Dov to the next picture, you'll be able to see that there is Esther sitting right next to Achashverosh, all the way on the right, and all the way on the left is Mordechai on the tree. So you kind of have here a summary of all the images that we saw. Vashti isn't here.
And there's a lot to
Esther, Achashverosh, Haman, and Mordechai.
There's a lot to unpack in this, and I said to Michelle, we're going to do a nahafochu because every Jewish art session and lecture and discussion starts with Dura Europos, and I said we're going to leave it for the end if we have time. So I'm not going to go through everything there is to unpack here, and I'm not exactly a scholar of Dura Europos. But one thing that's very, very obvious is that Mordechai and Achashverosh are wearing exactly the same clothes. And the fact that's what we talked about at the beginning also, the V'nahafochu. And Mordechai's robe is even longer and he's bigger in the picture. And that it went from Achashverosh being on top to Mordechai being the victor. I think that's
yeah. And for our last set of images, we want to do some unabashed product placement. And just to recommend again the new Israeli commentary created for Megillat Esther, which I wrote, which Dov Studio designed, which Avigdor Shinan edited, and which the Avichai Foundation helped produce. And the 6 out of the 10 new designs created by Dov Studio, especially for this image, we started with the idea of Esther saying, "Write me for the generations, kitvuni ledorot." And I think the best service we can do to Esther and to Mordechai is to continue to retell the story of Esther through our own generations. What will the COVID Megillah Esther be? What masks will be drawn this year as we're retelling the story of the Megillah, as we fight the terrible virus of Haman? That's what is up to all of us to do in our families. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. I appreciate you listening, everybody. Thank you, and Purim Sameach.